Hello, friends. This week there was an accident in Indonesia involving an ATR type airliner. It was approaching when it disappeared from radar or stopped communicating, and it took rescuers several days to reach the crash site. Unfortunately, these kinds of crashes happen with frightening regularity in Indonesia. It seems to be a country with a lot of accidents. And when you look at the records, you often find very limited infrastructure. So airports sometimes without approach systems, without navigation aids. There are old planes, crews flying kind of like lawnmowers, without checklists, without briefings, without following procedures or anything. And then also, sometimes, as we'll see today in the example I'm going to use to illustrate a bit of the danger of aviation in Indonesia, we'll see that sometimes it can even go as far as having charts that are completely wrong and that pilots use for navigation. It's August 2015 and we're on a Trigana airplane. So Trigana is an airline that still exists today, which shows you a certain tolerance in the country towards accident-prone airlines that might not have been allowed to fly elsewhere. Trigana, roughly speaking, if you look between 2000 and 2015, that's about 8 or 9 crashes. Of course, sometimes there are accidents that aren't their fault. Like one time during the approach, someone opened fire on a plane, injuring the co-pilot and the captain. They lost control. The plane crashed in a chaotic way, and it ended up killing a passenger and also a crew member. So sometimes, as you can see here, sometimes it's just bad luck. But often we have deadly runway overruns, we have fires, we've had sudden evacuations, planes crashing into mountains. So it's something that happens repeatedly and seems to be accepted in the country. Today we have this ATR-42 aircraft that's going to Okcibil. It's an airport that's nestled in a mountainous area, not very far from the border with Papua New Guinea. And we have this crew that's flying, doing their 5th flight of the day. You should know that people who fly ATRs, well, one of the challenges of their job, it has to be said, is the frequency of the flights. Whereas you have someone who's on, let's say, a Boeing 777 doing long haul flights who might do maybe 2 flights a week. Well, you can have these guys who can do 6 or 7 segments a day, every single day. So after a while, indeed, on one hand, you have fatigue, but you also have routine. That's why they kind of go into lawnmower mode, okay? So there's no checklist, no briefing. We're used to flying this way here, and that's just how it is. So our plane has to go to this airport for the second time today. Now, there's a problem. This airport doesn't have any navigation aids. There's no ILS on the runway. It's too expensive. There's no control tower. So there's an information service with a guy inside with a radio, but he's not an air traffic controller. He doesn't have the authority of an air traffic controller. He also doesn't have a radar. He has nothing at all. So he's just there to help a little bit, and that's it. There's no VR there. There used to be an NDB, a beacon, a non-directional radio beacon that had been out of order for as long as anyone could remember. There isn't an approach chart. So what we did is that the airline took it upon itself to design a visual approach chart. Because what I just told you, since there's no approach system, well, we're forced to do it visually. The problem is that to do it visually, you need the right weather. That means you need visual meteorological conditions. But that day, well, there were clouds covering almost the entire sky at 8,000 feet. Okay, 8,000 feet is an important number here. So our aircraft is descending. It was at 11,500 feet when it made its call on frequency and started its descent. There are 54 people on board, and the crew is going to do a simplified approach. So don't look for a simplified approach in the procedures. They made it up themselves. It was a common practice, meaning when the company designed its approach, they made a little drawing and everything. They created a chart. The approach consisted of doing this. So you had to arrive from the north. We often arrive from the north at this airport. And so we arrive. We fly over the airfield. So we're going to fly over it. It's in a valley. So we fly over it. We need to see it. And then we make a sort of slightly twisted rectangle that lets us descend into the valley while keeping the airport in sight and then come back to land. So it kind of makes us lose time, in quotes. Even though it's a procedure, it has its limits, but there's a certain logic behind it. There's a certain intelligence behind it. The pilots pretty quickly will abandon it. What do they prefer? They prefer to do a direct approach. That means starting to descend over the mountain, coming in to intercept the runway center line, and landing. For them, it's much, much simpler. So when there are weather conditions that allow it, why not? Except that on that day, there wasn't any visibility. There are 100 of them in the clouds, and they're going to try to make this approach. So 8,000 feet. Well, 8,000 feet, there's a whole story behind those 8,000 feet. Why? Because on the available charts, there's what's called an MSA, the minimum sector altitude. It's an altitude that the authorities are required to define around each airport or significant point from the airport. It covers, an MSA covers roughly 25 nautical miles. We're talking about 46, 47 kilometers. And then it's an altitude that gives us a floor, right? It gives us a minimum altitude we can descend to, and we have a certain guarantee. So if we look at the ICAO documents, or we look at private pilot or airline pilot courses or others, what do they tell us? They tell us this. In the courses, they tell us the MSA guarantees you 1,000 feet above the obstacles in the area. What does that mean? It means that the people who define the MSA will, for example, say, okay, we're going to define it around the airport. They draw a circle of 25 nautical miles. Then, if in this circle there's, for example, an obstacle that's 4,000 feet high, we'll add 1,000 and set the MSA at 5,000. So that someone who is inside this circle knows that in the worst case, they can descend to 5,000. Even if he were to fly over the highest mountain in the sector, he would have at least 1,000 feet of clearance above it. ICAO documents are a bit more detailed and will say that if there are significant differences, for example, imagine you're at Nice Airport. For example, to the south, you have the sea, it's flat. Behind you, you have the mountains, you see. In that case, what we'll do, if there are significant differences between sectors, like more than 1,000 feet difference, what we'll do is define a sector MSA. It's a bit like a laughing cow cheese. You have sectors, and in each sector we'll define an MSA. So just to be really precise, ICAO, which is a UN agency, works in meters. So when they define altitudes, what do they say? They say that you find the highest obstacle and add at least 300 meters, which is, in parentheses, 984 feet. So actually, in theory, it's not 1,000 feet, it's 984 feet. But well, that's just for discussion, okay? It's not 1,000, it's 984. Afterwards, we round up if necessary. We round up to the next highest 100 feet. Now, our pilot, he is currently flying in the northwest sector of the airport. The MSA is 8,000 feet. What is he doing? He's descending to 8,000 feet. Thinking to himself, I'm at 8,000 feet. Well, then, there's no problem. I'm in the clouds. The ceiling is also at 8,000 feet. But from time to time, I'll be able to get visual references. And I'm sure that at some point there will be a place where I'll see the valley, I'll see the airport so I can land. His reasoning in itself, taken in isolation, is not wrong. It's not wrong. But if we put all that back into the full context that he's flying, that he doesn't even have a GPS, he doesn't have any radio navigation instruments, that he's just doing whatever, that's a problem. Why? Because just like that, he can't guarantee that he's really in the area in reality. He will be in the area throughout this flight. But just to tell you, the MSA, well, you have to be sure that we're inside it. Without navigation instruments, we can drift out of it. See? Let's continue. We keep descending like this then. We contact the control tower. We're waiting for him. We're waiting for him to show up any moment now. After a while, he still doesn't come. Nobody lands. So the guy in his airfield office, well, he picks up the radio and starts calling. No one. He thinks given the weather is marginal here, maybe they went somewhere else. You know, they diverted. It happens. They didn't tell anyone. He starts making phone calls here and there. Then after a while, you have to face the facts. That plane must have crashed. So the search begins. It's in the afternoon, around 3 or 3:15 p.m. The search is quickly interrupted because of the heavy rain and all that. The next day they search again. It takes 2 days to spot a kind of black scar in the forest. The aircraft, the plane, crashed into the mountain. All right, so the investigation is going to be very difficult because it will take the investigators days to reach the site. When they find the black boxes, the DFDR, which is the data recorder, there are two black boxes. One records the data and the other records the voices. The latter was okay. The one that records the data had been out of order for at least 2 years. We're in 2015. The last flight we found recorded on it was from 2013. So you can imagine these are airplanes. Here we're talking about the black box. But you can imagine that the rest of the plane, the engines, the instruments, everything is maintained pretty much the same way. So there's a maintenance backlog on everything. So that's why we won't have all of the data. Maintenant. Now there's something they're going to discover. It's that the MSA that was published was actually wrong. Why? Simply because when you get to places like this, a bit remote, you can never trust the published data, even if they're published. In fact, this MSA had even been shared with navigation system manufacturers. For example, it was shared with Honeywell. And in the Honeywell systems, there was this incorrect MSA, for example, just to point that out. So the guys who could have made the approach in an Airbus A320neo, they would have gotten caught in the same way. You see, because there is false information being communicated, because the MSA, in the end, when you arrive in a country or a region like that, how are you going to measure it? You're going to send a few people, maybe 2 agents, who will either look at old maps or go to the location. But in my opinion, they don't actually go to the location. They'll take old military maps that might be 50 years old. You don't really know who made them or under what circumstances. We'll extrapolate from there. We make an MSA, we compare, and then that's it. Okay, the information was wrong. In reality, they ran into a mountain that rose up to 8,300 feet. Imagine you have a chart that tells you you're safe at 8,000 feet. You're safe at 8,000 feet, but what if an obstacle is 1,000 feet below you? And finally, you have a mountain that enters the MSA and goes 300 feet above. And that's not unique to this region in the world. There are a lot of charts published today that are wrong, but sometimes they're wrong in a really dramatic way. So here, if we take the MSA, it should have been at least we take the 8,300 of this mountain here, Mount Tongo with 2 Gs. Well, it should have been at least 9,300 feet, but it was 8,000 feet, you see. GPWS, normally the aircraft was equipped with an IGPWS. EGPWS. Normally, it should have, given them an alarm saying the ground is approaching and so on. Now, there are 2 problems. The first problem is that the EGPWS is based on a global map. However, the global map had an error. So it would have an error on the coordinates, on the altitude, and so on, to begin with. Deuxièmement, secondly, there's the possibility for the GPWS to detect rising terrain using the radio altimeter. So it would have still given a warning. And here we realize that it's a very common practice in the company to turn off the GPWS because, it's a warning system, not a terrain avoidance system. It's not a system we use on a daily basis to avoid terrain. It's an ultimate safety measure. It's the last resort before impact. It's a system that detects approaching terrain and will signal it with a voice alert, an alarm, and other warnings. The problem is that since these planes were always flying in the mountains and sometimes literally had to navigate inside canyons, to land, the GPWS was constantly setting off alarms. They kept getting false alarms. They're flying visually and know what they're doing. And then they had this voice that became really annoying. So what did they do? Regularly, they would pull the GPWS circuit breakers. Sometimes for several flights in a row, the GPWS was completely deactivated. In fact, there are a lot of companies. Take Air Mouton, for example, which operates at airports like Paro and others. They fly there in an Airbus A319. In their checklist during approach, they turn off the GPWS. Otherwise, it's not possible because at one point they fly inside a canyon with mountains at each end that are higher than the plane, with mountains in front of them. You just need to weave at the right time and avoid taking wrong turns. And so they have to turn off those systems. So these pilots, if you will, died without ever understanding what happened. The guys thought they were doing the right thing and flying normally. Then suddenly everything went black. So these 4 people were killed in that accident. Just another one in the long list of Indonesian aviation crashes. The company, Trigana, well, it continued. It kept operating until today. By the way, just to tell you that this wasn't for lack of experience, the captain of this Trigana flight was a little over 60 years old, I think, 62 or 63, and had 25,000 flight hours. All right, so you see, 25,000 flight hours don't guarantee you anything at all. All right, because you can have 25,000 flight hours, you might think, well, he survived that long, so in some way he must have been good. Yeah, but the problem is that sometimes you become too sure of yourself, too good. Routine slowly creeps in. And then until the day you get hit, that's it. It's very hard to steal in this kind of place. And in a way, maybe the only thing that can save you is to take what's published, what's said, and add a lot of personal margin to be on the safe side. Thank you, my friends, for watching this video until now. Let me remind you that there are at least 14 or 15 videos today in the supporters section of this channel, either on Patreon or on the dedicated playlist on this channel. And I am making them very, very regularly. Thanks for letting this channel exist. See you next time.